Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Village ZM podcast. During the month of October, we're talking history, Zambian history, solely focused on our people and what led to this common identity we share. Being Zambian means much more than just citizenship, so join us on this journey of self-discovery through in-depth analysis on anthropology and historical content.
One who Zambia, one who nation, one who Zambia, one who nation, one who Zambia, one who nation.
Sana, have you been on a podcast before?
Yes, I have.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, just not on Discord. I like the system. It seems organized. Yeah, I have.
I mean, it's been we've had to learn a lot of trial and error. Yeah. Okay, so are you guys ready?
Yeah,
we're good to go.
Yeah. Wonani, you want to count down for me?
Okay. 3, 2, 1, go.
What's good, everybody? Welcome to another episode of the Village ZM and our final episode for Zambia History Month. Thank you so much for listening to our journey. Thank you so much to all of our collaborators. And it's just been a really fun journey. And we have also learned a lot about Zambia just as much as you guys have. And hopefully going forward, this is not just something that we celebrate as a podcast, but also something that's celebrated throughout our nation in different organizations. And also, like, it should be a different way of marketing our culture amongst ourselves and also to the outside world. So yeah, it's been really fun doing that. Keep in touch with us. Keep giving us feedback. We're going to have more episodes after this. We won't be solely focusing on Zambia history after this, but we'll still be having great episodes. We always have great content, and I can promise you, if you keep listening to us, you won't be disappointed. So yeah, over to you, Wonani.
Thank you, Malimba, for such a good intro. Hi, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of the Village ZM. Today's episode is really interesting, just like the others have been, but today's is slightly different. Today, we're going to be going a little bit into educational history and all of that, but we're also going to be talking about the present and the future. Today's episode focuses more on art and culture, looking through a lens of photography, and I have a very special guest with me today. Her name is Sana, and she's going to introduce herself, talk a bit about herself later on. But when we were doing the planning for Zambian History Month and the topic on art and culture came up, she's the very first person I thought of, and I told this to her as we were planning the episode. She's the first person I thought of because her work and what she's been doing is something that intrigues me, especially from a photography and historical point of view, because the two are related, and photographs can be used to tell history, to help us know more about who we are, our culture, where we're coming from, and all of that. So welcome, Sana, to the podcast. So excited to have you here.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me, Wonani. My name is Sana Jinwala, and as Wonani described, I work with photographs from the present as well as the past. I run Everyday Lusaka and Zambia Belonging, and they're both platforms that seek to alter and change the narratives that we have around what Lusaka looks like and what Lusaka means to us, primarily looking at photographs to begin with. So that could be through mobile photography, or you can look at images from the past. My background is in photography and curatorship. And this is the work that I do for the most part. But I also lecture at the Open Window University, and I work at Alliance Française Gallery as a curator. So I work a lot with different artists that are not necessarily photographers. But thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for joining us. You mentioned working with Zambia Belonging and Everyday Lusaka. Do you mind telling us more about what that is, especially for those who are hearing that for the very first time? So what is Zambia Belonging? What is Everyday Lusaka? What do you do with it? What inspired it, the vision, all of that good stuff?
Everyday Lusaka began in 2018. I was born and raised in Zambia, but I went to study in the UK for my undergraduate in photography. And I finished that in 2017. And while I was there were just a lot of those misconceptions that people had when I would tell them that I'm from Zambia. Many of them would not know where that was, or would not. Once I told them it was in Africa, they sort of had a lot of stereotypical views of what that meant. And I kind of came back to Zambia with a bit of an anger about this. I said, why are people thinking of us in this way? Like, what is causing this discord? And I realized that we as creatives in Zambia are also responsible for the type of imagery we put out. So to sort of channel this anger into something positive, I decided, let me try see how people respond to images that we can relate to every day. So moving away from wildlife, moving away from sunsets and poverty and things like this, which are definitely realities that we have, but sort of looking at the things that we see every day. So taking inspiration from Everyday Africa, we began this on Instagram in March 2018. And that was just an online thing, just to see how people respond. And then offline work that we did was all to do with print. So we started doing postcards. I was photographing a lot more in Lusaka, so making images that I could then make into print items. And it was through that process that I came to find an old selection of photographs from Zambia in town. So on Cha-Cha-Cha Road, there's Fine Art Studios, a little photographic store or stationery store that I went into and found a bunch of old photographs. And that then spiraled into a collection of images that looked at Zambia from the past. So it just sort of happened by chance that that year became a very strong year in terms of my relationship with photography. I was taking photographs, I was printing them, I was posting them online, and I was finding them all in different formats and taken in different times of the year and centuries and decades. So yeah, that was how Everyday Lusaka and Zambia Belonging began. So in 2018, and since then we've done a few exhibitions in Lusaka, publications as well. We're looking at making the work go international, and the idea is just for people to relate to photography in a different way, and to use it in a more intentional and meaningful way as well. To be sensitive to what it means to share images of our city, of people, of our realities. Because in this day and age, photographs kind of last forever, especially when they're online. So yeah, that's the context with these two projects that I run.
Okay, so when you spoke about the pictures or the images from the past, first of all, I must say, guys, for everyone who's listening, it's a very interesting project. If you check out their Instagram, which of course we're going to plug later on, you will be so amazed like how far back those pictures go and what they communicate, what we're able to learn about what Zambia was like back then, or the fashion, the culture, and whatever. So because Sana has worked with these pictures for a while, I want to ask you, like, what are some things that you've learned about Zambian culture back then through the photographs you've come across? Are there any specific things that stand out to you, say in the way pictures were taken and how people just, what are some things that stand out to you? What have you learned about our culture?
I think one of the main things is that the same things that we're interested in photographing today resonate in the images from the past. Of course, now we are in a position to film as well and photograph almost everything. But the main occasional things that we choose to photograph for sure in this day and age is like family, weddings, graduations, like an unusual sighting, a holiday, a wonder of the world, whatever it is. These are generally like the common ground as to the type of content and the type of things that people chose to photograph back then. I think that's generally like the universal thing. But specifically to do with Zambia, I think that from the collection that I found at Fine Art Studios, what I became interested in was the type of demographic and people that would walk through that studio, and how the studio really was this space that everyone used to walk through. Whether you were a freedom fighter or you were a dignitary or getting your ID passport photograph taken for your passport, the studio sort of becomes this space that kind of neutralizes everyone. And it was just interesting to see a small archive that I suppose personified the type of people that lived in Lusaka in a certain period of time, specifically through the studio's collection. And so they back in the day were situated just next door to the UNIP headquarters. And so they did have people like Dr. Kaunda walk through Mainsachona, and at the same time also had everyday regular people having their photograph taken, whether they were Indian, white, black, Zambian, whatever it was. There was this very diverse nature of what the studio did, regardless of who you were. And also like this idea of wearing your Sunday best when coming into the studio was a really big thing. So people would always look their best when they came into the studio. There'd always be a stool there or some sort of flower or garland. Often people who wouldn't get to see their kids very often because of work would have photographs with their kids as well. So it really was a time, I think, where people were photographing things that they found very valuable to them. So it could be a family. Sometimes it would be people who had record players or records or books, radios, things that they found that they wanted to document to show that, oh, I had this. This needs to go down in the books. So yeah, I mean, I think generally photography from studios or family archives sort of show us so much about the desires and prospects of people during the time. But specifically from fine art studios, it's just been a lot of people who I don't personally know, but there's just so much commonality between everybody, regardless of age, race, gender, things like that. I don't know if that answers your question.
It does. It does. And I love the idea of people wearing their Sunday best. I think that's one of the most interesting things in the pictures because people went there for a photo and they meant to look good in the pictures.
Yes.
I also like how some of the pictures I've seen where, I don't know if I'm right to assume some of them were like people in bands because you'd see and all dressed the same. And, it also makes you think about what music was like back then or where we're coming from musically and how people were intentional with how they looked. They have their suits tailored and I find that also fascinating and glamorous hairstyles and,
Yes. So in fact, all of the types of photographs you just described were exactly the type of photographs that were on display when I first entered Fine Art Studios I think that was June 2018. So when I went into the studio, it was exactly what you described. So all the musicians. So there was this wonderful portrait of Paul Ngozi and then Mwale Sisters. And then there were two other bands who I've not been able to identify the names of. And then there was a portrait of a lady with this very intricate hairstyle. And these were all images that were on display in the studio. And it doesn't even look like a studio. I mean, you can still go and visit today and see, what I mean when I tell you it doesn't look like a studio. But that was the one aspect of that space that made me aware of its past or its association to photography in the past. So it was exactly that type of photography that I came across. And I realized that they specifically put images of these very well-known faces because it's what people related to the most. So definitely, even when I used these images of Paul Ngozi for a recent exhibition we did to launch Zambia Belonging, it's not recent anymore. That was in December last year. That was the first thing that people would stop to look at him because he was such an instantly recognizable figure. Almost in the same way, dare I say, the same way that Dr. Kaunda is also a very recognizable photographed being, in Zambia. So Paul Ngozi has this sort of public figure feeling, and the fact that he also walked into Fine Art Studios was kind of like their way of kind of showing their pride in being like, well, we also photographed, popular people, famous people in this place. So I really like that sort of story about the studio and the fact that it was run by an Indian family, an Indian man, as were many photo studios, really hit home because I am originally Indian as well. And just sort of being this person in I guess, the Indian diaspora, but identifying as Zambian as well as Indian was interesting to me because the studio and all the others, the contemporaries, were responsible as Indian Zambians to record and preserve and produce memories on behalf of the public. So I became really interested in those sort of conversations in relation to me as Sana as well, which is why the project was called Zambia Belonging, because I realized that belonging is a very universal feeling that people are often preoccupied with. Whether they feel like they belong or they don't, it's still something that I'm interested in, So not everyone's story of belonging is linear, whether it's to a family or a place or a home or even themselves. It's not always linear. And I'm interested in those sort of conversations. And at the moment, the way we're exploring that is through photography. in the future, it can be anything else. It could be audio, it could be music, it could be food, it could be a piece of clothing. But at the moment, because photography is such a universal language, and it's what I've been given as a starting point through this discovery of this collection, it's what I've chosen to run with, to explore this feeling of belonging.
I absolutely love that. And as you've gone and told us the stories of the studio and all of that, it makes me think of storytelling and history through photography. From the pictures I've seen and the photographs that you shared on Instagram, most of the time, my first thing is to try and imagine what was going on that particular day. The picture of the little boys outside standing in front of a bush, it's like, I'm pretty sure those kids were outside and one of the clients found it nice and said, okay, come together and let's take a picture. And messy and all of that. And that tells a story of, say, those days children used to play outside more often than they do now, and things like that. So how important would you say photography is in recording our history and telling stories that maybe we didn't even know needed to be told?
I think on an individual level, it can really help you to connect to your sense of connection to a place and a people. Even if you don't have the privilege of having access to your own family archives, what I'm wanting Zambia Belonging to do is to allow anyone who has a relationship to Zambia to find a little bit of themselves in the collection. And I think once we do this, once we create a very inclusive platform, because it's also what's the value of doing is because that's where the world is moving towards. I think everything is becoming so much more globalized. I don't think singular identities are going to be a thing in a couple of years. I mean, I just think that it's a way for us to become, I think, a bit more empathetic as well towards one another, because when you see more of people inside an archive, like for me, for example, I don't see a lot of Indian stories in the Zambian National Archives. But when we have an inclusive approach to it, we get to understand people's stories of migration, of belonging, of heritage. And I think it does a lot for feeling like we have a place in the world, and also having a bit more, I suppose, pride from where we come from, and feeling like it's okay to not always have a complete understanding of like, okay, I am 100% this, or I'm 100% that. It also allows us to sort of have a place value on different things, because I think also what I'm trying to do here, I call it a counter archive, because I'm wanting it to be accessible, right? I'm wanting it to work differently than how museums work. Because museums and archives often have a hierarchy of what they consider valuable stories to tell. Even if you go and see shows in the past 10 years at the museum, what type of content did they have? It's not often things that I think the majority can relate to. So for me, it's to really question this idea of value, because whether you know these people in that beautiful photograph of the young boys outside the house, the young kids outside the house, that's still a valuable story and a valuable memory to somebody. And it's still valuable to the general discourse about social history in Zambia. So these are the type of images. So what I have in the collection, I call them an orphaned collection of images, because they haven't been collected by their rightful owners. They were just discarded and forgotten about. And for now, I'm holding them, so that eventually I'm able to repatriate them, make it a very public event, and have people access them, because I saw the value in these photographs, in their potential to activate memory, to activate more intergenerational conversations. And also, I think because things are becoming so digital, I think this tangibility of having images in your hands and bringing it back to that can ground you a little bit more. So for me, there's a lot there. There's memory, there's this idea of value, this idea of preservation, inclusionism, and empathy as well, that I think can come out from creating a more thoughtful and inclusive collection for future generations. So in 5 to 10 years, as people decide to have children, and maybe they're not fully Zambian and they're from the diaspora, how do they let their children understand what it means to be Zambian but living elsewhere, or Zambian but speaking many different languages? How do they identify themselves in an archive that has been working on producing and maintaining itself for the past few years in a way that reflects the society of Zambia? So for me, it's really about looking at what do we have now and how can we improve that system in a way that speaks to the needs of where we're going to. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yes, it does. And it leads me to my next question. I recently came across an article that you wrote where you were writing about how you've learned about, say, extended family, having been raised in Zambia, now getting to meet people who you will probably never physically meet, but meeting them through photographs and whatever. I would say that's one of the benefits, or that's why photography also could be important. So do you mind sharing with us what you've been able to learn about yourself or your family through photographs that were taken years ago?
Yeah, I mean, that's an article that I wrote during my curatorship honors. So I just, edited it into an article. And that was just a really great way for me to really understand why it is I'm so obsessed with photographs. And I realized it's really because that is just what my family has been doing for a very long time. One thing we do is always photograph, like even till today. And so we have, by virtue of that, we have a lot of images in our family collection, and they're not all in one place because some of us live in Zambia, some of us live in India, etc. So what it taught me, I think, was that, first of all, my family loves photography and always has, that we have a large collection, and we're really privileged that even between the massive migrations that my family has gone through in the past 50 years, that there's still been some weird preservation that has taken place. It might not be perfect, but really privileged to have access to this content still. And thirdly, the fact that what photographs can do in terms of activating memory and intergenerational conversations was brilliant, because when I found this new collection, well, it was new for me, this new collection of photographs in India 2 years ago, I was obviously very excited. And so obviously the first people I would ask about these photographs was my grandparents. And so they're very elderly. At the time, my grandfather was still alive, and their memory is not great. But a photograph really does something so powerful in activating a memory. And obviously, memory is not always reliable, but there's something about how my grandmother would look at a photograph of herself from 40 years ago, 40, 50 years ago, and not remember a thing about what was happening that day, why they took the photograph, where they were going, but she'll remember in detail the dress and where the dress came from, and which friend gave it to her, and where it was sewn, and where the material came from. And for me, that became really interesting because it's something that we go through as well in the everyday. So if we try to remember how our 2020 went, I mean, I think the whole world can say it doesn't count, but there's some key moments that we'll probably remember about that year, even though many other things were going on. So it taught me a lot about that. It taught me a lot about things that I suppose would not usually come to light had this photograph not been discussed about. You know, there's a lot of writing about how this gathering around a photograph often does something for families, because it becomes this sort of medium through which families can discuss very intimate things that perhaps wouldn't generally become a point of conversation over dinner. So I write about this late grand uncle of mine who was very beloved, and I always hear my parents and everybody talk about him very dearly. And I've grown up seeing photographs of him. And even though I've never met him, I knew who he was because they'd always say, this is Kasim, Kasim Mama, Kasim Mama. So when my dad had come across these photographs that he has so many copies of this man. He told me, like, oh, I want to be photographed like this one day. Like, one day you're going to photograph me like this. And for me, that was a really special moment because my father's not the type to say something like that, but you could tell that this photograph of his late uncle really, like, how do I say it? It triggered this very emotional response from my father, which in tune did something for me as well, to sort of feel like, I wish I met this man as well. I wish he was alive. I wish I could have had a conversation with him. So it's not always fantastic, wonderful revelations. Sometimes you're left actually feeling quite sad because you're confronted with the realities of death and also loss. And sometimes some of the stories that can come out of these conversations perhaps are secrets that families don't want to share. I mean, that has been the case sometimes with some contributed photographs where people don't want to discuss a photograph or the photographed person because there's so much perhaps pain around it as well. So for me, it does a lot. I mean, there's so much value in photographs that I think people often don't realize unless they sort of interact with them in the way that is collective as well.
I think this answers perfectly also regarding storytelling through photography. And it makes me think of how years back, or, when we would have guests come over, the first form of entertainment was to get our old photo albums and start going through and, telling the stories about why these are what they are and whatever. And I don't know, maybe it's just my family, but we don't do that much anymore. But
yeah,
like that was
it's not a thing anymore.
No,
yeah,
unfortunately not. Unfortunately not. And it was just good to learn really about who I am or where I'm coming from, seeing great grandparents who I've never met, but knowing what they were like and all that stuff would really spark important conversations. And it also now makes me think of how photographs spark conversations that allow us to know more about who we are and where we're from. And while, this is about Zambian History Month, talking less about Zambia as a country, but more of Zambia as an individual and knowing who you are as a Zambian and where you're coming from as a Zambian is something important, because I feel everyone at the end of the day feels like you want to belong to something or you want to be a part of something. And so where there are gaps of where you don't know who you are, you don't know where you're from, you just have this constant sense of longing. And that's a good place for photographs taken in the past to come into play, because then you learn so much about yourself. Yeah. So I loved reading that article and I loved how you've explained it, because I'm of course always looking for ways to, how would I see myself in that situation? How do I bring that back home? And it makes me think of that.
Yes.
Because now again, I'm remembering how I I don't know who my relatives are on my grandfather's side. And now I'm thinking, if we were able to take photographs, or if my family back then were privileged to take photographs, know that part of me. And now sometimes I think how there's a whole group of people who I maybe cross paths with, and and I have no idea that.
And you might be related to them,
Exactly, I might be related to them, and that's like a part of my history that's just erased or blank, and I have no idea. Like, I don't know anything about that, what my culture is from that side and whatever. And that's where I imagine the photograph would have helped.
Yes, definitely. We once had an instance where, so the Zambia Belonging collection, I don't think I described exactly what it consists of. There's this found collection from Fine Art Studios, so that's around 400 images that we found from people that I personally do not know. And then we have the contributed photographs from people who have consented and shared with us their stories. So on Instagram, most of the recent posts are all of that. And then we have people who were photography enthusiasts back in the day and were just taking photographs of Osaka and people and events. And some of them even ran their own studios in Kanyama and things like that. So there's these three aspects of the collection. So as we know, there's this repatriative archive, there's the contributed archive, and then there's the, photography enthusiast side of things. But because this repatriative archive has so much content there, we're in a position soon to do a bigger exhibition whereby it's just these sort of quote unquote unidentified or anonymous people, because I want a lot of people to come to the show and be able to say, hey, that's my grandfather, that's my grandmother. But we had this instance where somebody had reached out to say that she's Zambian and she lives elsewhere. I think she lives in the UK. And she said that all of my family photographs were destroyed in a fire when I was growing up, and I don't have any photographs. I have no access to my past, but by any chance, do you think we can go through your collection to see if I can identify myself or my family in these photographs? And I just found that to be so beautiful, because this was a person who has no access to a visual understanding of her past because of this fire, because of lack of preservation, which is another problem that we come into whenever we're trying to get images from people, is that there's no value given within that family into taking care of the photographs or the storage of them, or even just sort of making sure they're in a safe place. But unfortunately for her, there was a fire that took all of these photographs away from her life. And we went through the collection, really, really sifting through to see if she could find an image that might have been her or her mom or her dad or her grandfather. So this interesting sort of reversal use of this repatriative archive, whereby people who don't have photographs might actually find something of theirs in the collection. And unfortunately, she didn't recognize herself, or I don't think any of those images were hers. But there is that aspect of people who are really trying to seek that out. And I think that's really important, because there's many different ways we can do it. And one can be through photographs, others can be through letters, audio, journals, things like that. But photographs often are this universal thing, because you can just say, okay, I can recognize that face. That looks like my mom's mom. Or that was taken at what looks like my grandfather's house. So it becomes a bit more of an accessible format, I think, to access our past. And whenever I try to think of the outcome when I write a piece or I curate an exhibition, especially for Zambia Belonging, the first main one we did, how I was going to measure the success of the exhibition and my curation of it was to see how people were affected enough to want to go home and look through their own photographs and speak to their mother or their grandmother and just have that conversation and completely rethink what is in that box at home, with all the photographs piling up that no one has opened in the past few years. And I was really, really pleased to know that at least like a couple of people, those who did come up to me and tell me, said that. They were like, oh, I just want to go home and speak to my grandma. And I'm going to go home and look for these photographs, because I'm pretty sure my mom has a photograph taken exactly like that, or she's posing in the same way, or I'm pretty sure she went to that studio as well, or my dad had the same shoes. Or there was just so much that people could relate to, that now they wanted to physically see for themselves and actively make that motion of removing the photographs from their box and speaking to their parents about. And that's honestly all I wanted for the first go, is because it was a challenge to sort of think of, okay, we're going to do a photographic exhibition in Zambia, in Lusaka, and it's not of Dr. Kaunda, it's not of political leaders, it's not of recognizable people, it's just of everyday people. And how am I going to make this interesting? How am I going to make people actually care? Because there were still people saying like, oh, who are these people? Or like, oh, I think you should have photographs of so-and-so here. And for me, that really showed the challenges we're faced with at the moment in terms of what people are wanting to see or expecting to see or used to seeing. But at the same time, it did still have the positive effect of people feeling like their stories mattered and that they had a sense of ownership in the collection as well.
That's so beautiful, actually, and answers. I was going to ask you, what do you hope to achieve when you do your exhibitions and all that stuff? And I think you perfectly answered that just now. And yeah, like I said, also it goes down to also just knowing our personal history as Zambians, where bringing it down to the individual and what your family was like and all of that good stuff. But as someone who studied photography, what would you, this is for people who are interested in photography or want to get into that space, what would you say are some things to consider if you want to take a picture or a photograph that really tells a story? What's the best way to tell a story through a photograph? What would you say are some things to consider?
So I think with photography, I mean, there's so many different fields and whatnot. I think one of the main myths that I'd like to completely deconstruct, especially in the Zambian context, is that first of all, you do not need fancy equipment to make a good photograph, to make a good image. I think a lot of people sort of think that if they have a fancy camera or this brand or that brand, it sort of makes up for the image. But I personally don't believe that. I think that the main thing is to really exercise your eye. And when I say that, I mean you need to really be quite observational as a person. So observant as a person. So I think if you're an observant being, you'll find that your eye is trained to see certain things, and then translating what you're seeing into an image. That's the technical and the bigger challenge. That's the big art of it, is that you might see a really perfect shadow on your daily walks every day. And you're like, how do I photograph this exactly to evoke the feeling? and not have to worry about what equipment you're using and etc. I think it's really about using your eye, being observant. And if you're going into, photojournalism or documentary photography, then there's more to that. There's more to creating a series of work, having to speak to people, having to write about it. So I think there's several aspects to it. It's about composition. So if you're going to work on your composition, you need to be more observant and shoot regularly. Secondly is to sort of be open to speaking with people. If you're going to create a narrative or a story around a topic or a person, you're going to have to speak with them and translate that into writing or into photographs. Writing and photographs often do go together. As much as people think they don't, there is an aspect of writing that pairs very well with photography. And then, and also just not being limited by the equipment that you have. I would just say practice, observe, work on composition. I think that's the main thing that makes photographs really important, is how you compose an image. Don't just take photographs from one standpoint, move your body, and oftentimes on the more general part, you will find that as you continue shooting and you look through the work that you're shooting over the next, months and whatever, you'll see that you might find that there's certain themes you're constantly drawn back to, that you keep coming back to. And you can only get to that point if you're shooting often and you stay curious and you stay observant. And you'll only be able to, I think, do a really good job on a personal project if you actually have that passion for it and you actually care about it, and that it means something to you. And if it's for commercial gig stuff, then that's something different. But generally, if you're wanting to shoot a body of work, it needs to be something that I think photography can add to and not necessarily dilute from. Or sometimes you can go into an overkill of constantly filming something, constantly photographing something, and sort of loses its spirit. Whereas other projects, by giving it that life through photography, you're really elevating it. So I know that sounds very vague, but that's sort of the general advice I can give in terms of that, because I'm sure there's many listeners who are interested in photography of different types, because it's a massive, massive field. But from the context from which I'm working in, and my experience, that's sort of what I've found. I hope that's somewhat helpful for our emerging photographer listeners.
It is. I'm very sure it is. I kind of feel bad that there's a certain period in my life where I was not taking pictures of myself or what I was doing at all, because I don't know what emotional thing I was going through. And I said, okay, I'm not going to take pictures. I don't know what kind of decision that was. But now, when I think back, I have nothing to show for certain periods of my life. And that's one thing that I regret personally, because sometimes I remember, oh yeah, I did this, and I want to go check, and I have completely nothing.
No evidence of it. Yeah.
Yeah, no one's going to believe I jumped off a cliff, which
no one's going to believe you.
But yeah, pictures where it didn't happen, and so it's I'm not a photographer or anything like that, but it's something I think I'm more intentional about these days. I'm going to take a picture, whether it turns out or not, I'm going to take the picture just for record's sake. And this leads me now, we've talked about the past, we talked about the present, but then I also would love us to talk about what are we doing now. We're currently writing history. We're writing right now.
100%.
So what are we doing to ensure that what we're writing currently is there for other people to see, for the people in future, Are we actively writing about the current events? Are we taking photographs and all that? How well are we doing in terms of telling stories of our present through photographs? And do you think we will have things to place in museums or photographs to explain and tell the story of our current Zambian culture? Because when you go to the museums, a lot of the things are, from way back when. But do you think we're actively preserving certain things to place in the museums 50 years from now that would depict what the culture is like now?
I think as Zambia, perhaps there's more we can do, but in terms of objects and collecting objects currently that are relevant to us now, that could be anything. But I think in terms of like projects that are occurring generally, like for example, Everyday Lusaka is one of those projects that's looking at what's happening currently, right? So like we have photographs of Lusaka looks in the daily during these years, 2018 till now, showing people that exist digitally. Yes, we do have some print items, we have some postcards, things like that. We have platforms like Women's History Museum that have their Leading Ladies podcast. We have people who are producing books that are talking about the experience of being Zambian, being in diaspora. There's Tasho Makodi Banda who's doing that. There's Namwali Sapel. There's Chobela and Dilila, who are all producing books that are, I think, in their own way going to become archival material of what people were preoccupied with in the 2020s, right? So I think in terms of like existing projects, I think people are picking up on it at the moment in terms of how are we preserving and talking about ourselves now instead of complaining about, oh, there's nothing from Zambia or there's nothing in the history books, da, da, da. So there's that aspect. There's also people that I know who are developing course content that is, looking at Zambian fashion, Zambian history. And I think also the education system, so like my involvement with, an institution like Open Window, which is one of the first art universities, like specifically dedicated art universities in Zambia, is exactly for this reason, is because we can talk about tangibility, right? Like objects, what objects do we have? Also, what are the minds that we are shaping now to help create an art industry in the next 5 to 10 years that is a bit more intentional and thoughtful in terms of what they're creating. And we talked very briefly and touched on how one identifies as Zambian, or what does it mean to be Zambian. And I think we're all preoccupied with that at the moment, because I think my argument is I don't think there's much that we can say that is quintessentially Zambian. It's not like we have like a particular music sound just yet, or a fashion, or like like a lot of the things that we have just been coming through by way of migration, which is great, which is a great story of Zambia in itself, and how it's always been this sort of neutral space throughout all the wars that were taking place during the independence struggles. But I think for me, it's an ongoing thing. So I think that's why also, like with Zambia Belonging, it's about really looking at what we're doing today, so that in the future, and with Everyday Lusaka, what we're preserving today, it becomes relevant for future generations. And I think it's going to take time. I'm not discouraged by it. I'm actually quite encouraged by seeing how many amazing books and things are out there, podcasts, audio material. People are creating bodies of work that are dealing with memory and what it means to be Zambian. One of the artists I work very closely with, David Makala, I just created a show for him at Alliance Française, and he was really looking at this feeling of what it means to be David and what it means to be Zambian, what it means to be Black. And that all of the bodies of work, the sculptural work, the print work he has created is in itself an archive. It is something that is relevant today and will continue to be relevant in the future. And that is what I believe about this podcast we're doing right now, about the work we do as individuals, as Zambians, whether it's to do with Zambia itself, as people coming out of this country. The work we do in itself becomes part of how Zambia is seen and preserved in the future, So yeah, I have a very general sort of understanding of, I think, what it means to preserve for the future, because there's so many different needs that will come up, I think, and desires. I think the desires of people 50 years ago is very different from now, and we can't really preempt what the desires and wants of people will be 20 years from now, even 10 years from now. So working in this way, I think, allows it to be quite inclusive and very, I think, anti-establishment almost, because I think when you look at how archives and museums function, they have a certain hierarchy or certain qualification of what they think needs to be in a collection or what they assume should be preserved. But I think I'm wanting to move in a direction where it can be a bit more, I think, a bit more diverse than that, basically. So yeah, that's my sort of thought around that.
Yeah, I love that, especially you talking about trying to be more diverse and some breaking the hierarchy that exists, because it sure does exist. So yeah, it would be nice to move away from that. But really quickly, because we should be winding up now, I'm going to ask, because you mentioned your projects that you're running, like Zambia Belonging, and we have places like Alliance Francaise and the National Museum. In terms of funding and resources really to help you scale up your projects, how is that going for you? And what would you like to be done for artists who work in fields like this and whatever other fields exist similar to this?
Yeah, so for context, I mean, I don't really have a solid permanent team with whom I work on with Everyday Lusaka and Zambia Belonging. I just have very kind friends and mentors who I hop on a call with every now and then to say, what do you think of this, and etc. So I work on this completely by myself. It's not a project that necessarily it doesn't have a lot of revenue. Let me put it that way. It's not really something that I'm doing for profit. But in order for it to reach a lot of people and in order for it to continue, of course, it needs some sort of funding or input financially. You know, there are big things that we still need to get done if we're calling ourselves a digital counter archive, which is a website, like a very comprehensive and well-designed repository website whereby all of the photographs in our collection can be easily found and accessed by the general public, because that then feeds into how people learn about Zambian history. It becomes an educational tool. So that's one of the big things in terms of accessibility that I'm really wanting to prioritize. And then there's things like exhibitions and books and print material that I often enjoy doing, because then that becomes a more physical way of allowing people to access our work and become involved in it as well. So for me right now, it's really about looking at partners who would be willing to support Zambia Belonging in the long term to help us develop these projects. If it's even in a small way, if you really love what we're doing, you can get in touch and say, how do I make a donation? How do I become a patron? Because the project really is for the people and it's by the people. And I am one person. And so I want people to feel a sense of ownership with the collection, you know, whether it's through the contributions they've made through photographs, but there's also, you know, monetary contributions you can make just so that I'm able to hire people and employ other people to help me do the work I'm doing, whether it's through scanning or interviewing people or even developing a website. So there is always like help needed and wanted. And a lot of the time, as it is with most things, it's the most, you know, effective and quick way to do that is through a monetary sort of contribution or through a partnership that allows the project to grow and give it its own identity without having to sort of align to another brand or anything like that, you know. So that's kind of where we are at the moment. It's a long project. I know it's going to develop and take a very long time for it to establish itself fully. I see it as my life's work. But the more sort of commitment and support we have from the beginning, I think the more results you'll see, and that investment, I think, will reap a lot of benefits very soon. Because I mean, I believe a lot in this project, and I'm sure a lot of people do, but it's just the sustainability of it. It always comes down to the administrative aspect, which I'm sure a lot of people who do this type of work can understand. So yeah, that's it. Show me the money.
Yes, please. Anybody who's listening and would love to fund Zambia Belonging and everything else, please contact Sana.
Yes,
Thank you so much, Sana. There's so much more we could talk about. We could keep going because I still have things I want to ask. And I think I'm probably going to have to now ask you personally because unfortunately,
no worries.
This is all the time we have. And before Sana goes, I just want to say, please follow all her social media, check out her Instagram, check out Zambia Belonging Everyday Lusaka. We're going to link her socials on our social media platforms. And yeah, I hope if you're going to take anything away from this episode as a listener, it's to be interested in who you are as a person, where you're coming from, what is your history, what's your culture, where are you coming from, and what are you doing to actively write history for those who are coming after us. So yeah, we all belong to this beautiful nation of Zambia, but there's so much more about you as an individual as well. So yeah, let's actually dig into that. Let's really find out who we are as people and where we come from. So thank you so much, Sana, again. And
thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much to our listeners for listening to every episode we've put out this month of October. It has been so much fun preparing for these episodes and talking to lovely guests like Sana. I hope everyone has learned so much. I've learned so much about Zambia's history and also about myself. And yeah, like Malimba said in our intro, I hope this is not going to be something that ends on our platform and only for this month, but I hope so many other people will pick it up as we really learn what it is to be Zambian and to learn more about our country. So yeah, be sure to follow us on Instagram, Twitter, everywhere. We're at The Village, at The Village ZM. Thank you so much for listening. Please do interact with us on Instagram on these episodes. Ask us your questions on Twitter and let us know what you think about everything spoken about today, who you are as a Zambian, and everything. We're looking forward to hearing from you. Yeah.
And
yes, Sana,
if I could just add one thing to end our full time together is that our platform is completely open to anybody who's willing to contribute their own family photographs and stories. So if you have even just one particular photograph that means a lot to you, we will scan it for you at no charge. All you have to do is meet us, give it to us, and we'll give it back to you, and you'll give us a bit of a story about it, and then we'll share it, and that in itself becomes a way of preserving this particular story from your family archive. So if you're looking at how you want to write your own history, we are a platform that's constantly doing that and can only continue and grow through people's involvement in the project. So yeah, I just wanted to say that it's a platform for everybody to become involved in it, and yeah, go home, look through your boxes and see what you might find.
Thank you so much, Sana.
Thanks for having me. Thanks guys for listening.
Thank you for listening, guys. See you in the next episode. Bye. Okay, done.